Good evening, comrades. Welcome to the latest of the Labour Left Alliance's educational series. And this evening's topic is debating the Spanish Revolution. And I must say, I'm really looking forward to this one. When I was a much younger man, when General Franco was still alive and his regime was coming to an end, socialists in Britain did a lot to carry out solidarity to our comrades in Spain. So, and like lots of people, the Spanish Civil War, the Spanish Revolution, and what went on there wasn't just history. In some ways, it was quite a living memory. A lot of older comrades, when I got involved in the labor movement, had either been involved in solidarity work, and a couple of them had actually been in Spain. So it's something I've always had a deep interest in, so I'm really looking forward to this evening's discussion. Matthew's going to speak for around about 30 to 40 minutes. He's going to do an introduction about the nature of the Spanish Revolution, and then we're going to throw it open to discussion and comments. Can I ask people to do the usual thing here, which is to use the raise hand function if you'd like to be called into the discussion, or if you've got a problem with that, some people can't quite use that function, it's not on their devices and so on, use the question and answer box. It's all well and good to do chat, and I know comrades like to do that as they're going through, but if you would like to ask a question, please use the raise hand or the question and answer box. It's quite difficult for the speaker and for me as well to keep up with that. So that just makes things a little easier. Okay, so I'll just hand over to Matthew now, and we'll get on with debating the Spanish Revolution.
Hi comrades, good evening. I like how this one's a debate, because I'm presuming I'm supposed to say something really controversial. Anyway, so yes, as Kevin has said, obviously Spain has a huge impact on much of the European left. Obviously, particularly the Civil War, but even before that, and afterwards, and of course, obviously the fall of Franco, the end of the Francoist regime in the 70s, marked a major move in terms of the change in Europe, and in fact a service by particularly the CP to the Stalinists to once again ensure stability. Although, of course, the rights were somewhat less happy with that. Obviously, some people may remember the invasion of the Spanish Parliament. I think it was 1981 by a sort of one of the more dissident Spanish army officers. So Spain, of course, obviously, I think the one thing you have to say about it, or one of the things you have to say about it during this period, was largely an agrarian country. Although, of course, much of the action we're talking about takes place in the cities, obviously driven by the working class, as we would expect, under the conditions of politics. In fact, I think somebody estimated that something like 70% of the population was still working on the land. And therefore, that really is the background to all of this. And of course, obviously, if you're looking at action in Barcelona or Madrid or any of the other major industrial centres, it's still quite a minority of the population. I think the other thing, of course, is that it's a huge subject. I mean, obviously, you've got a series, quite a lot of different aspects of history, and people have written enormous books on it. So I'm only going to cover little bits, really, and hope that provokes a debate. I don't doubt it will. I think the first thing is obviously the deep instability, I think, of Spain in particular on the land, and among the workers, but particularly on the land where obviously the landowners themselves are being squeezed by the changes in agriculture, and they were pushing that pressure onto the peasants and the day labourers and so on and so forth. It was continuous instability, and this, of course, was then added to by the advent of the Russian Revolution, which, of course, people in Spain completely rightly translated as an action into the Spanish context. And here was a peasant, largely peasant country overthrowing its a fairly autocratic regime, which is what Spain was. The parallels were very clear. And so what you had, obviously, under conditions in the First World War, where Spain, I mean, much of certainly industry in Spain had huge amounts of work from working for the mainly for the Allies, but also from all sides in the First World War, that you had an eruption both among the peasantry and among the working class, and a series of uprisings put down by the army. What was spoken of as being the Bolshevik years of 1918 to 1921, and in which obviously there was a great deal of savagery employed, particularly obviously by the regime. I mean, you can go through in terms of Victor Serge was there, details obviously that then the efforts of the following the risings, the efforts of the regime to assassinate particularly the leaders of the CNT. And to try and flatten this rising, and they did this. There were a series of people who were important leaders were killed, and in fact, what resulted was a dictatorship, the dictatorship of Primo Rivera throughout much of the 20s. So what I'm going to try and go through, following that, really the end of that is then the end of Primo Rivera in 1930, the end of the monarchy in 31, and then some of the political organisations, and I think also the importance of the rising, the two key events of the Spanish Revolution, which was July 1936, and obviously the suppression, particularly with the assistance of the assistance and motivation of the Stalinists in May 37, which really marked certainly the finish of the Spanish Revolution. There was only one way from that point onwards, and that was downwards. I think that in terms of there was extreme instability in terms of the regime. There was also an exceptional degree of hostility and bloodthirstiness of the Spanish ruling class, particularly the landowners, who regarded the peasants and so on in their workforce as basically subhuman, and were quite happy, and in fact made a point of killing people, and there was this continuous series of incidents over every point, and the conditions in which conditions for the peasants and the labourers were the point, in many cases, the point of starvation, particularly the labourers, and so you had the use of both by the landowners themselves and by the civil guard, the Guard Civil, continuous repression. I think that in terms of once you get from 31 onwards, obviously you see extreme political instability, and for me, I think the most important thing is you have the emergence of a series of political organisations, and most of which, of course, have roots in the long term. First of all, the Spanish Socialist Party, actually what's actually called the Spanish Socialist Workers' Party, PSOE, which is the historic Socialist Party of Spain and part of the Second International, which was also really the only organisation you could say had a complete national coverage. Most of the others were regional, most of or small, and grew very rapidly. The SOE actually had a national base, both in industry with its union federation, the UGT, and on the land with its peasants organisation, the FNTT. And so it was the conflicts between the peasants, the landowners, was largely run with and through the PSLE. This was split, of course, into two wings, the left and the right, and formed a large part of the Republican government, or governments within Spain in the 30s, and particularly, obviously, the Popular Front government. I think the second force you have to look at, obviously, is the anarchists. And the anarchists, of course, were based very largely in Catalonia, although, of course, with some very strong bases in, particularly in Asturias, in the mining areas, and in the Basque Country, and those areas around Catalonia. No, I mean, obviously the anarchists, obviously, is the CNT, the Trade Union Federation, actually at one point were quite close to the Third International when it was first cohered after the Russian Revolution, and in fact sent delegates to at least one congress of the Third International. However, the anarchists then organised themselves as the Iberian Anarchist Federation, the FAI, and moved away from the Comintern. This is obviously in the early 20s, before the rise of Stalin. There was a clear difference between them and the Comintern. However, the CNT itself is by far the most militant of the Union federations, and in fact, of course, there was a tended to be a continual rift between the CNT and the UGT, and the CNT was actually the most active, and the UGT always used to regard the UGT and so on as a bunch of scabs, not without cause, and they tended to hold, as I say, the position in terms of the most militant part of the working class, particularly in Barcelona and Catalonia. Although it's interesting actually that, of course, the bulk of their membership actually, by some assessments, was workers in smaller workplaces. The third movement really is the Spanish Communist Party, the PCE. The Spanish Communist Party, of course, interestingly, of course, by the late 20s, of course, with the infamous course of the efforts of the Stalinists, that the Spanish Communists and the efforts of the Stalinists and the appalling, the Bolshevization stuff and the whole business, particularly in China, the Kuomintang and all this, the alliances of four classes, and all this messing around that Stalin was doing with in terms of the political direction. The PCE was down to about 500 members at this point, and that meant that the split actually to its left of some forces was probably was more significant in Spain than in other countries. However, during the 30s, obviously the PCE was able to grow rapidly as the situation heated up, and grew to some certainly 10,000 before the Civil War, the outbreak of the Civil War, and at the same time there was also, of course, efforts, particularly in Catalonia, to unify parts of the left, and there was a negotiation between 6 different currents, including the PCE and the two currents I'll speak of in a minute, which formed the POUM and some other organisations. And actually, what happened was that the PCE was able to take off form of an organisation in Catalonia, the PSUC, with these other organisations, which are generally more right wing, and in some cases, were actually sort of fairly much bourgeois parties, and at the same time was able to take over parts of the UGT, and then to recruit very largely in among the more right-wing elements of the working class and even into the middle classes and so on. So the PCE grew extremely rapidly, and at the same time, obviously with the Stalinist understanding of the situation, put in a lot of effort and a lot of resource. Right, it had obviously access to resource from Moscow, etc., and were able to put in a whole series of full-time functionaries into places like Madrid and particularly Barcelona in order to try and cohere their political current. The final current, which obviously is important in the whole process, is the Party of Marxist Unification, the POUM. The POUM actually originates in two different organisations, both of which you can see as splits from the Comintern, or they do originate splits from Comintern. And the first of which are the block of workers and peasants around Morin were actually been in the Comintern until quite late, I think 1930 or 1931, and had actually agreed with Stalin on a whole series of issues. Broke with the PCE at that late point. The other one was the ICE, which at that time, certainly the original point was the section of the nascent Fourth International based in Paris, the Trotskyists. Now there was obviously a significant disagreement in terms of between the ICE and the International Secretariat in Paris in terms of tactics and how to proceed. Now certainly Trotsky and others argued that the ICE should focus clearly on the Socialist Party as a larger formation, and particularly the Socialist Youth, as it was doing elsewhere in France and in other parts and in the US, where obviously you had significant sections. The ICE was much more interested in negotiating with the BOC and Morin, and actually, as warned, it meant that it left the Socialist Youth open for the Stalinists to recruit them. And in fact, large chunk of the Socialist Youth were recruited from the PSOE youth to directly to the PCE. And in fact, the historic leader of the PCE, Santiago Carrillo, comes from that move. He came originally from the PSE youth. So there was a formation of the POUM, which, as I say, was a fairly heated affair, and particularly in terms of an attitude towards revolution and towards the Popular Front and so on. And the POUM was actually only formed in 1935, so immediately before the outbreak of the fascist revolt or the army revolt in the following year. And in fact, of course, had quite, was relatively small. I think the ICE only claimed about something like, at this point, about 800 militants, whereas the BOC claimed about 4,000. Of course, under the conditions, you would see extreme rapid growth, which is what happened. But politically, then there was a whole issue in terms of would the POUM actually support, particularly the Popular Front, which obviously dominated by which was essentially a Stalinist maneuver, but obviously with the assistance, particularly of the PSOE, the socialists, and then obviously capitalist parties. And they, unfortunately, of course, the POUM did this and actually traded their political independence for what turned out to be a single deputy in the Cortes, Morin, because they were offered three and the other two were in the south. And actually what happened was when they went there to Cadiz and elsewhere, they did well, they had no cadre. There was no cadre of the POUM in these areas. And the socialists and Stalinists refused to cooperate with them and stand them in the election and so on. So they wound up with one. They sold themselves for one deputy in the Cortes. In that sense, I think as I say, that's the lineup of forces as you go into the revolution. Obviously, in 1936, you have against the Popular Front government the revolt of the army. Importantly, obviously, this was the army. This was the army based in Morocco, and obviously had was seriously lining up with the landowners and the far right, and an evolution of the far right itself. The creation of the Phalange, an openly fascist party, particularly based on the youth, which was essentially worshipped violence against the left in particular, and actually, again, a historic sort of issue of the Spanish far right, seeing the left as anti-Spanish, and this continues to this day. I don't know if people have seen the letter that was issued by some Spanish officers recently, saying that they need to slaughter or get rid of 26 million people in Spain now because they're anti-Spanish. So you have the rising of the army and the effort of the army based in Morocco to overthrow the regime. And herein obviously lies another question, which was posed, which was the whole question of imperialism and of the colonies. I mean, in contrast to the Portuguese Revolution in '74, where the army came back and was left-wing and overthrew the fascists. In this case, obviously, despite the offers including from Abdel El Karim, who was the historic leader of the Moroccan tribes, who led a very successful revolt against the Spanish. The Spanish government refused to liberate or renounce its claim to Morocco, because obviously it wasn't prepared to break with the capitalists. So you have an army revolt, but however, of course, the reason one of the reasons this was unsuccessful basically for two reasons. One, because it was resisted to obviously tooth and nail by the working class in particular, although it was successful in much of the country. And what happened actually was, of course, that once the revolt was declared, in the country, what tended to happen was the peasants and day labourers would hold hostage the local landowners, and the pattern of the Spanish Socialist Party, the SOE, would run around and say, look, you can't hurt these people. We should keep them and treat them well and all this sort of stuff. And then what happened, of course, was the army would move in and liberate them, and they would probably turn around and shoot everybody they could get hold of, particularly those people who've been holding them, which is just a lesson in how not to deal with captured reactionaries when you've got an army on the doorstep. However, it was a different story, obviously, in the cities. And the other factor on this was the fact that the army itself was split. Obviously, the majority were in favour of the revolt, commanded by Mola and then subsequently Franco. However, a minority did actually hold itself as being loyal to the government. And through that, that split in the army, which of course obviously is those of you who are interested in Engels, Engels always pointed out as being essential. It was partly the reason why the workers were able, to, while being very, having the mass of workers, they had very, very poor arms, very, very poor level of arms. However, the split in the army allowed them to gain access to certainly more arms than they had, enough to put, as opposed to, at the start they were talking about guns for hundreds of people, and they were at least able to seize tens of thousands of arms and put some kind of armed force on the street. within a day or two. In terms of the 19th of July, which is the key point, the army was defeated across, particularly, obviously, Barcelona. In terms of a quite savage street fight, and the loss of a number of people and key leaders, particularly the CNT, Ascasio, and others. Again in Madrid and in the industrial areas of the Basque Country, and although despite there was a certain amount of confusion in terms of Asturias, in which the miners, there was certainly no proper command in terms of making sure they'd actually done the job properly. So there were sections of the country that were held in those under those conditions. The problem then, of course, becomes obviously of the power of the working class. The working class itself has then essentially seized power, particularly in its main centres, and so you get sort of the out-arrival of the militias, the setting up of the Central Council militias in Barcelona, the origin of the great CNT and POUM columns and so on in fighting. However, there were some key political questions which were not answered, or were answered in the wrong way. One, of course, as has been pointed out, was that while there were set up, a series of bodies, there were no actual overall workers' councils. There were not Soviets or any equivalent of Soviets, which, as seen as in reading news, and rightly in my view, was critical. Actually, the working class has to have its own organs of power. Instead, of course, the capitalist organs of power were left essentially intact, although obviously seriously damaged. Oh well, I suppose you say there was certainly not the overthrow of the state. Obviously there was great damage to its standing and ability to do things, but the structures remained. And actually, interestingly enough, actually the anarchists in particular in Barcelona, actually after a certain amount of negotiation with companies, who was the head of the Generalitat in Barcelona, the anarchists actually entered the government of a capitalist government, which is extraordinary, really, given the nature of anarchism. That reversal should happen, and it wasn't sort of casual. These were seriously leading anarchists. You're looking at. The anarchists actually published, which you can get the biography of Durruti, of course, the most famous anarchist, and actually and the most militant. The guy who did phenomenal record. Seen as this sort of almost legendary bandit figure by the ruling class. Which he tended to behave like in some ways. But his one of his key lieutenants, Oliver, was actually entered the Generalitat, and they actually propped up the government. The other thing, of course, were the banks. Interestingly enough, Casa CNT, the headquarters of the CNT in Barcelona, was actually opposite the headquarters, the main branch of the Bank of Spain in Catalonia. The anarchists, of course, had no use for banks, so they didn't touch it. But having seized the factories, they could see no use of banks, which was extraordinary. So it was pointed out by a number of people. Obviously, you had a position in which the loyalist government of Spain, the Republicans, actually had one of the largest gold reserves in Europe at the time. And if they, if the workers had at least had the wit to seize this, they could have at least been around trying to bargain to get hold of as many arms as they possibly could, with this leverage. if the Bolsheviks can go and buy arms from the Finns using Tsarist currency, I'm pretty sure the Spanish workers used gold to get hold of better weaponry than they got. So that, in terms of in those terms. So the problem was, okay, what sort of government then emerged? The sort of government that then emerged, of course, was obviously the Popular Front. And the Popular Front consisted really, of the SOE, the Spanish Socialist Party, the Stalinists, and the Stalinists were absolutely critical. At this point, of course, the Stalinists had put in as their chief executioner in many ways a guy called Antonov Ovseyenko, who's the consul general. He, of course, had been an associate of Trotsky and a member of the left opposition until his capitulation to Stalin. Of course, once he'd fulfilled his last duties of butchering the left in Spain, he was recalled to Moscow and shot. So it's quite an extraordinary history. As I say, the Stalinists were really quite critical of the anarchists, and the anarchists actually, had ministers in the government, both in Barcelona and in Madrid, and then then of course obviously the capitalists. And the question really for the whole in these terms was, okay, how for the Stalinists and for the right was how they re-establish or maintain capitalism, because it was made quite clear by all, particularly the Stalinists, that there was no question of overthrowing capitalism. It was always the line, okay, well, you have to defeat the fascists and the army first, and then maybe at some point far future we'll think about socialism and so on, but there'll be under no conditions will there be any attack on the capitalists here. Other than obviously the anarchists and so on holding factories, which the Stalinists were determined to get back off them. So, I mean, as has been pointed out, I mean, the key question was obviously land. And the Republican government only said, well, we will seize the land only of known fascists, not the land of the landowners generally. Particularly obviously for the whole of Spain. Particularly that area held by the army. You say, well, okay, it is in your interest as largely peasant army of the Francoists that the land should be seized from the landowners and held and worked in common, which would have obviously sorted out a whole series of questions, but of course they wouldn't do this. I think the other event, which is really salutary, as I say, as in this brief expedition, is the May days of 1937, in which was effectively the crushing of the revolution. By this point, obviously, you had efforts to reconstitute the army as a bourgeois army, as an army of officers and a political army, and the efforts, and particularly, as I say, led by the Stalinists. There was also, of course, the efforts of the Stalinists, and particularly the PSUC section in Catalonia to get rid of the and oppress the militias and the workers' patrols, which controlled large chunks of Barcelona. So there was continuous skirmishes. And by skirmishes I mean things where people were killed. Particularly obviously the anarchists and members of the POUM. On May the 1st, 1937, the Stalinists and the assault guards, which was the sort of reconstituted police force, attacked or attempted to take the telephone exchange. The telephone exchange, of course, was held by the CNT, with a certain amount of cooperation with the sections of the UGT, and was one, of course, tower, which was everybody could see, was a symbol of the power of the working class, the dual power, effectively the situation of dual power, and also, of course, was the principal means of communication. So that essentially was a central point, for everyone. In fact, of course, all telephone communications had to go through, and therefore was held. Was an extremely important point to be held. So the Stalinists failed in this original assault because they got part of the way in the telephone exchange and then discovered that, of course, the anarchists had set up a strategic machine gun post as they attempted to get in and had to retreat. So following on from this, of course, then there was unfortunately. Well, what happened, of course, was the response of the working class was quite right, was to go into the streets and set up barricades, and the whole question was then back in the air. Okay, who holds power in these parts, of course, and the whole question of the political forces. The problem was that the political forces on the ground, which is primarily the CNT and then secondarily the POUM, insisted on negotiating with the Generalitat and the Stalinists, while the Stalinists spent their time working on means of attacking the positions of the workers and the anarchists. So what you get is a sort of series of farcical negotiations, and at the same time as these attacks are going on, and the problem being, of course, is the CNT followed by the POUM, and the POUM actually could have seized the leadership at this point. If it had given the lead, it would have been taken by the workers. Instead, they were telling them to because the negotiations were going on, they were telling them to go home essentially and leave these things. And what happened, of course, was that eventually, after 6 or 7 days, the anarchists were driven out of the telephone exchange because they'd agreed to demobilise. The barricades were cleared away. The Stalinists and the assault guards captured all the strategic points that were held by the CNT in particular. Obviously, things like railway stations and so on, so they'd held since 1936, since July 36, and effectively ended the period of dual power in Spain, and marked really the doom of the revolution. Follow this, of course, was a campaign of torture, of imprisonment, and killings of the left, led by the Stalinists, which of course was really put the lid on it. And under those conditions, it was a matter of time before the Francoists managed to break through and destroy the Republic. I think the last thing we should make some comment on, obviously, is the role of the internationals. And I don't think it's just the international brigades. I think it's internationals. I mean, what you had was a whole wave of people. I mean, tens of thousands certainly of people who came to Spain to fight fascism. Okay, and it tended to be that there were two lots. There were two kinds of people who came, or certainly people in two different positions. One, of course, what you got was people coming in an organised fashion, who then generally had some kind of a link to a given political force. In many cases, the Stalinists, in terms of the actual formal international brigades. Other people, of course, turned up under their own power, in various ways, and generally tended to align politically with the forces they linked up with when they got to Spain. So you've got various assortments of these kind of people. It's also extraordinary actually that has been pointed out in some places, quite an extraordinary number of people who fought in Spain who came from elsewhere were Jewish. I think somebody estimated about 6,000 of Jewish people from all over Europe thought, obviously it's a key fight against fascism. That was their duty to be involved. Unfortunately, of course, the international brigades were integrated into the whole Stalinist question and formed a part. The international brigades, the former international brigades, formed a part of the repression of the left, to the point where the international brigades headquarters was actually used as a torture chamber. And of course, the international brigades included, I think, the security department of the remaining, the surviving members of the security department of the KPD, virtually all of it, which was obviously a deliberate move on the part of the Stalinist GPU as a means of repression. However, I mean, there's no question that it did inspire a whole series of people in many different areas of Europe. And there were, I mean, things like, historic linkages. I mean, it's interesting. Actually, you look at something like the South Wales coalfield, the whole struggle of the miners in Asturias, going back before the First War, meant that, when miners in Asturias were defeated, and that happened more than once, they tended to leave for places where they could get work, like South Wales, where they were desperate for workers. And so what you had was a whole crew of people, particularly in the west side of the South Wales coalfield, who were of Spanish origin, or who worked with people who were of Spanish origin, and therefore there was in that area in particular, there was a mass movement of support. You also, of course, got international fascists, and interestingly enough, you've got in Ireland, you had both lots of people. You had obviously a whole series of people who fought on the Republican side, and then the blue shirts of what became Fine Gael fought for the fascists, although apparently not very well. So yes, an interesting. Anyway, so I'll open it up for contributions and questions. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, Matthew. You've covered really quite a wide area there, and I'm sure there's quite a few things that comrades want to come in on. Just remind comrades to use the raise hand function or the question and answer box. Just a couple of questions, Matthew, which have come in the question and answer box, and one is it's from Anthony Brain, and he says, why did losing the colonial war in Morocco during 1923, which led to a critical report about the conduct of the war, precipitate the coup which brought Primo de Rivera to power? And there's another question which I can't entirely get, I'm afraid, a little technical problem, but it's actually talking again about the loss of the Spanish Empire, and indeed those international factors. What impact did they have on the development of the Spanish working class, and indeed on Spanish politics? I've just to get the ball rolling, and it fits in with how you concluded. I wondered if you'd like to talk more when it's time to come up on the international involvement. I'm thinking particularly of the role of the various states. For example, the role of not just the well-known ones, the German and Italian states, but also the so-called non-intervention committee, and the role of countries which in a few years were allegedly going to go to war to save democracy, but seemed to be a bit slow off the mark in 1936. And perhaps related to that is a wider question about I suppose the international context, and something which you did touch on, and I think is important, is really to explain what the Soviet Union and indeed the Stalinists were doing. You know, how do you explain their strategy? You know, you talked, you know, about the very important role of both the Spanish communists, but also sections of the International Brigade in this. But what is the sort of reasoning? What's the strategy behind that? Particularly, I suppose, in the whole strategy of the Popular Front. Okay, I haven't got any further comrades at the moment, and I would appeal because, there's just when I said that, there's two came in. Okay, I'll just go on to Dave. Dave Hill, if you'd like to come in, please, Dave. And I'll just convert you to a panelist. Just give you a second to get over.
Okay, I'm just. Yeah. Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah, I'm just going to put your picture on a minute, Dave.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah. You got it. Yeah.
Yeah, you can see.
I didn't really want to come in first.
Here today. Okay, off you go.
Right, can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Yeah.
I didn't really want to come in first because my interest is post-Civil War. I was a photojournalist, including for Tribune in the late 70s for Spanish elections. And I do remember thinking at the time, well, not just thinking, analysing incorrectly, people were wondering who would come out strongest. Would it be the Communist Party of Spain in the 77 general election in Spain, the first democratic elections after Franco died? Would it be the Spanish PSOE or the PCE, the socialists or the communists? And it was a huge surprise when the socialists very much outweighed the communists. That was a huge surprise, especially considering the strength that the Spanish communists, the workers, what is it, the workers.
COO, you're talking about?
I forget the name of the
Workers' Commissions in English.
Yeah, CCO.
Workers' Commissions. Yeah, Ken Loach, of course, made a good film about the Spanish Civil War, quite a moving film, Land and Freedom. I remember being taken round. Remember, I was there just after democracy came in, and it really was a country on edge. I went to the headquarters of all the political parties except the fascists. And I remember going to the Communist Party headquarters, and there were armed police outside. Inside there, it was very difficult to get inside. Inside there were a lot of comrades with baseball bats. It was quite scary. And I think in his introduction, Kevin mentioned the attempted coup in '81 by Tejero Molina. You know, the comically tri-coloured tri-cornet hat, shooting bullets into the roof of the Congress of Deputies. What's interesting for me is what's happened since, and I realise we should really be talking about what happened 19 to 30, 36 or 39, but the pretty much disappearance of and in comparison to the hardline Portuguese Stalinist Portuguese Communist Party under Álvaro Cunhal, which it was under him, it's not under him now. The Portuguese Communist Party, a very hardline Communist Party, a bit like the Greek Communist Party, the KKE or Kukwe, still gets 8–10%, whereas the communists in Spain have dissolved themselves into one alliance and into another coalition with Podemos most recently, and they're pretty weak. Ideologically, it was very interesting with the rise of Eurocommunism. The main three people in that being Santiago Carrillo, the then leader of the Spanish Communist Party in the 1970s, and Fernando Claudín, another Spanish comrade, and Enrico Berlinguer of the PCI, the Italian Communist Party. And that was parallel, that departure from orthodox Marxism, that anti-Soviet, that liberal, more liberal reformist type of Marxism. Actually, it didn't affect some parties like Portuguese and Greek, who, as I say, have stayed pretty strong. But it did affect parties like Britain's Communist Party, which, under the influence of Marxism today and Stuart Hall, pretty much went into identitarian and culturalist politics as opposed to materialist analysis and explanation. And the Communist Party of Britain disappeared up its own backside, didn't it? It dissolved itself into the Democratic Left, then became an internet organisation. So I suppose I could ask a question here and say, ask the speaker. I wonder if he sees any relationship between what happened to the Spanish Communist Party in the Civil War and immediate post-Civil War period with its ideological development and its subsequent huge decline. One more brief point. I was in Spain recently, in Leon, and it was horrific. The most famous building in Leon was, which I visited, it was a concentration camp. And there's a little sign there amongst all the religious paraphernalia. There's a little sign there. This is in honor of those. And there were many thousands of Spanish comrades, Republicans, who were tortured and murdered in the, I forget whether it's the convent or the big convent, I think, in Leon. Brutal, but I remember being taken round to the headquarters of the Spanish secret police and by a comrade and telling me that you could actually hear the screams coming out sometimes under the Francoist torturous period. And it was, my final point, it was, I forget whether it or the Finnish Civil War were the most brutal, I think in 20th century, with a very high percentage of the population. I forget the percentage, 3-4%, murdered in one way or another. Yeah, okay, thanks.
Okay, thanks, Dave. Anthony Bray now. Come in now, Anthony.
Yes, I'll begin. I think that the important thing is the Spanish were the first capitalist empire with the feudal elements, and that's what's from the autocratic regime for a whole period, so like in parts of Western Europe. But then I think in the 19th century, there's at least 2 or 3 civil wars that became a republic. Then I don't get all my videos on there. Became a republic, then a monarchy, and then the Napoleonic Wars and everything that's going on since then. Some of that's interesting. But when they lost the Spanish-American War in 1898, was that a turning point in Spanish politics? But that's when they lost the world empire. But for the first time it was called the Rift Wars in the 20s. The colonial forces. The fight of the oppressed national bourgeoisie defeated Spanish imperialism, one of the greatest defeats of Spanish imperialism and the French imperialists in history. So I think some of that's interesting. But what Trotsky said was, if you do, like, get the analogy of the American Civil War, Lincoln Abraham Lincoln had to get rid of slavery. If you get rid of the landlords, you get rid of the capitalists. You whenever and the other thing was they're fighting out the main base of Franco, of course, was Morocco. So if they give them their independence, that would be in his place over. And I think Matthew talked about the peasantry in there. But I also think there's some other lessons of more contemporary examples of Spain. Some of the ultra-lefts had ultra-left tactics towards social democracy. Blairism had its own peculiarity. He tried to bourgeoify the Labour Party, but it didn't go away with it. It didn't go all the way he wanted it to go with, and that's those contradictions still revealing itself between New Labour and the Social Democrat. In Italy, it became a bourgeois party. In other parts of Western Europe, it was more social democratic. But there was a whole rise of ultra-leftism. Then we had a complete capitulation to popular front politics around Chirac. People were placing Trotsky on the room 6 years earlier, totally capitulated. And fascism's a threat in France now because of that politics. You do not trust a capitalist politician to stop fascism. You have to fight for the independence of the working class. I mean, the argument at the time was who handed the power to Hitler was Hindenburg. The other thing was Egypt. A lot of the so-called Trotskyist groups, really were centrists, they were adapted to the bourgeois military during the overthrow of Mubarak, or they'd adapted to the fundamentalists. I mean, these are some of the state capitalists who don't recognize the working class nature of Stalinism, but they thought the fundamentalists in Iran were a working class force, the same with the fundamentalists in other parts of Egypt. Complete opportunism. So that's why, if you look at the Socialist Revolution in Egypt, Trotsky at the same time, the Puma had been the Trotskyist Revolutionary Party. With 50,000 members, they could overthrow capitalism. What that disaster did, they challenged the imperial intervention into Libya with the counter-revolutionaries. And look at the mess we're in. The Russia and the Chinese workers haven't stood up to them, we've even been in a bigger mess. But the contradictions are building up. But I want to talk about, that last part I want to talk about is the communist development. I mean, all over Western Europe, they're thinking Bangladesh on the hundreds of thousands and talking about open borders. So that undermines all the right-wing racism, but also the pro-EU chauvinism and posing a left alternative to the EU. And they're setting up more and more detention camps, even in where they got inroads in Lithuania with the Stalins and elements of the capitals are sharing power. They're going to mass detentions now of the immigrants. So the important battles in the war against East Europe against capitalist restoration, tied with the battles in Western Europe. But what we got now is a big youth radicalization. I don't know if people heard of TikTok. I've just been looking that up in the last couple of weeks. You've got hundreds of thousands, millions of you looking up communism in their 20s. I mean, some of them started in this youth. No difference between Trotskyism and Chapmanism. There's a lot of radicalization. That's going to leave up. One more sentence. Trotsky's been followed by 5.7 million people on TikTok. They said on Twitter, on what's that called? Instagram and TikTok, Trotsky's trending really highly. So that's very interesting. And I noticed that following all the trends. I think that I've been following Trotsky, but it's also the rise of communism on the party. The Pen's gone down in the vote in France, really got devastated. The AfD have lost a lot of the neo-Nazi parties lost a lot of votes. But will the left party now hold the, I don't know if they've gone to a chauvinism, well, I don't know. But they'll be opposed to the imperialist war drive against Russia and China, and they could hold the balance of power with the Green Party. Which I wouldn't be in favour of them going in, impose demands on them. I mean, the Greens are fairly bourgeois. Soon we're going to a coalition with a bourgeois party. But with Russian national demands, we don't know. But that's what they're worried about, the floods in Germany. The left party could hold the balance of power, and that could undermine their war drive with Russia and China. I'll leave it there.
Okay, thanks, Anthony. The next comrade is M. Murray. M. Murray, if you could come in now, please.
Yeah, can you hear me okay?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to start with a question. I missed the very beginning, but I'm not sure what was said about popular frontism, which seems to have been a failed policy, particularly in Spain and France as well. So I missed that bit, I'm afraid. Just some of the bits that I've got from reading the Orwell classic Homage to Catalonia, which is an object lesson in journalism, actually. I believe that the Republican government, on at least 2 occasions, refused to arm the working class after the coup had actually taken place or during it. I think they even had wind of it before it actually happened and refused to do anything. Also, just to say, I believe the POUM was urged to turn to the rank and file anarchists, and they refused to do that, and that was one of the reasons that they didn't, that they failed. But on the other hand, it just shows what political parties can do, because it went from a tiny force to a force of, I think it's quoted as 100,000 in a very, very short space of time, which is what can happen in revolutionary situations. It's easy to knock the anarchists, but you know, there was some who stood out. Durruti, I think I've got the right name, Durruti Column, did a fantastic amount of work, and he was murdered probably by the Stalinists. But they did tremendous work conquering land, distributing it to the peasants and all the rest in the northeast of Spain. And just to say, yeah, I lived in Spain for 20 years, up to 2 years ago, so much in the democracy. But I did get to meet Carrillo, the old Pethe, the PCE leader, and shook his hand on one occasion. But I wished I hadn't when I found out on reading his obituary, because as Matt explained, he had two terrible roles. One, after going to Moscow, he came back and managed to convince the socialist youth to join the Communist Party, therefore putting them under the Stalinist influence that he'd learned over there. And very much so in the transition period, when he signed a terrible deal, which means that the victims of Franco, which have been talked about, can still see their torturers in the street. The main building in the main square in Madrid, Sol, was also a torture chamber. Nice, pretty building nowadays. They don't like you to know about it. But every Thursday for years, there's a campaign outside it if you ever go there including a Thursday. And just to end, it's just a slight bit about the Communist Party. I don't know if we've got any followers here, but they still deny that this is what happened, despite Orwell's eyewitness account, despite the works of Trotsky, despite the Ken Loach film. When that film came out, they denied it happened. Yes, they had brave fighters going over in the International Brigade. Met some of them. I mean, they were in the 90s then. I don't know if any are actually still living. It'd be interesting if anybody knows. But yeah, that's still their position as far as I know. Just to say, Alan Woods, who was also there in the last years of the transition, has brought out a new book. It's out in English, but it's coming out in Spain in the autumn, which will cause a massive stir in Spain. It's called The Spanish Revolution Against Franco, subtitle, but it's The Great Betrayal, in which he makes the case that the Communist Party was the best organized force during the transition and could have taken power with correct policies. But it will be very interesting. The mainstream media will try to ignore it, but for anyone who doesn't know the current leaders in Spain, they all regard the transition as a model that we can transport to Latin America and all the rest of it. But as people have pointed out before now, torturers were let off. They're still digging the victims up on a daily basis throughout Spain. And there's a fascist party in councillors, MPs, called Vox. Sorry, I hope I'm not over talking here. But I actually think it will probably fracture and maybe become something like the National Front in Spain, but time will tell. But they're taking a lot of votes off the Spanish Tories at the moment, and the third right-wing party has just collapsed, Citizens, as it was called, Ciudadanos. So we'll see what happens there. But I mean, it's hard to explain, but sometimes when you hear Tory politicians talking in Spain, you can see, I mean, they are literally blood relations of the Franco ministers and all the rest of it. They're still there. They've still got all the power, and the left needs to get its act together, basically. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, comrade. Last speaker in this round is Dave Turner. Just before Dave comes in, if you do want to ask a question, please use the raise hand button. Okay, Dave, off you go.
Thank you, Kevin. Thank you, Matt, for brilliant presentation and analysis. The thing that really struck me, something that the previous speakers just said, and something that you said earlier in the initial moments of what you were presenting to us, and that was the essential agrarian core nature of economy and society in Spain before the events of 1936 onwards. And it drew me back to the work of Arno Meyer, who's still actually alive as a sort of Marxist historian. He's 95 and he's still working in Princeton, I think it is. When he wrote the book, The Persistence of the Old Regime, he used the book as an analysis to explain the First World War, which he called a sort of revolt by pre-modern, pre-bourgeois, pre-capitalist elites, aristocrats, and their followers. He described Europe in 1914 as landed and rural, and not yet bourgeois and urban. And he produced a lot of empirical data about the economies. And it's as though the Spanish experience is a mini version, in some respects, of pre-modern, pre-capitalist elite formations in society. Our previous speaker has just alluded to the direct organic relationship between certain politicians in Spain and holders of power who are not elected but in secretariat roles, and their relations to Franco's regime. Franco's regime in itself has deep roots in the landed nature of older Spain. And so I just wanted to make that observation and say what a great presentation you made. And the other point I'd make is one of the earlier speakers, Dave Hill, mentioned the Finnish Civil War. And I would totally concur. I've studied that for about 25 years and Finnish history. And I would totally concur that the proportion of the population, the Finnish, by size of population, the proportion of casualties, deaths, and people killed in captivity is simply, harrowing in terms of the Finnish experience. But thank you for an excellent presentation.
Okay, thanks, Dave. And if you'd like to come and just respond a bit now, Matthew, not many questions to deal with.
Oh, yeah, there's a few some interesting ones. I think the thing is, comrades are saying, that obviously people are still digging up the victims of particularly obviously the Franco regime and so on. The problem for many people is they're not digging up. They're actually, their relatives and so on are still buried, and there's no sign of them being able to exhume or to have some kind of an understanding of what went on, or even a reckoning. As there have been in many other countries. There's there's not really any of that. There's been bits, but not to anything like the degree. As you say, I think in terms of the fighters of the Civil War, from the Republican side, some of the last few actually died of COVID, unfortunately. At around the age of approaching 100. In most cases, I think I saw some obits. Some of these guys who fought in the Second World War, who were also Spanish Civil War veterans who died. And I don't think there won't be that many people left who actually fought that conflict. In terms of what's been said for the impact of 1898, I couldn't say at this point. I need to go and look at it. It's really that, I've not looked at that far back and really sort of concentrate in terms of the Second World War, so the First World War onwards. And in terms of, Rivera, but I think the impulse for the Rivera dictatorship, of course, is the instability in Spain itself, and as you point out, obviously the revolt within Morocco, led by Abd el-Krim, who actually drove the Spanish out of large chunks of, well, nearly all Morocco at one point. They very nearly lost completely, and actually he was eventually went into exile on Réunion Island. The French brokered his exile, but he offered. That was the point. He offered to the Republican government to the point of he'd asked will you liberate Morocco? Because it's an obvious, in terms of any socialist position would be to do so, but of course they refused to even consider it. Which shows you what kind of people we're dealing with. That they wouldn't, move against the ruling class to that degree. I think in terms of what Kevin's been saying in terms of the Stalinist strategy, quite clearly by that point, you're looking at the point of where Stalin had done this, basically he had done a series of flip-flops. First of all, in the late 20s, from the block of 4 classes and so on, which led to the disaster in China, as we discussed last week, to the third period, and the war of class against class, which again led to disaster in Germany and elsewhere. And then, of course, the Popular Front, which are essentially what they were naked, openly doing, was currying favour with the imperialists. And essentially, what they were doing was carrying out a job for imperialism, saying we're safe, you can deal with us, we'll not cause any trouble, and except we'll make sure we finish off these troublesome leftists. So I mean, a really horrible record. In terms of, I mean, foreign nationals who fought for Franco, I mean, as I think it was asked in the chat. Interesting enough, of course, there was long-term links between the Spanish far right and Mussolini. And Mussolini actually was the one who was actually supplying arms to the far right, and before by the early 30s he was supplying arms to the nation, to the Falange and so on, shipping tens and hundreds of thousands of rifles and other weaponry to these the right wing, and in fact, of course, there was intervention by both the Italian army and the German army in the Spanish Civil War, and famously led to the clash between the exiled Italian anti-fascists and the Italian fascist army, which made some people happy and other people lesser. I think in terms of the PCE, I mean, I think, obviously the evolution PCE, I mean, as Dave Hill said, I mean, and others have commented, I mean, the key person here is actually Carrillo, because, I mean, he obviously, besides playing a role in the Civil War itself, also then negotiated this foul deal with the Franco regime to allow that obviously there will be a handover. Nothing will be said. There will be no investigation. All of Franco's henchmen, thugs, etc., would go free. There was no, no incriminations, no investigation. All the bodies would literally remain buried, and that was the deal that he was principally responsible. And I mean, you can see, obviously, the PCE, but the PCE, while we can say, okay, it's in many ways it's dissolved itself into various sorted deals and so on and so forth, including Podemos, but I mean, it does have an effect. I mean, the thing is, I mean, if you look at the people who actually ran. Particularly Iglesias, who ran Podemos until recently. I mean, he was essentially a Stalinist, or is a Stalinist. That politics remains on that side, and that's one of the things you always have to see in those terms. I think you talk also about the Durruti. I mean, I think Durruti is a really interesting character. As I say, the anarchists have released a biography years ago of him. I've got one. I'll put it up on the book reading list. He's a very interesting character. As I say, very sort of romantic anarchist character who basically, I mean, his response to the killing of Salvador Seguí, who was the leader of the CNT, in particularly in the rising of 1919, was to attempt to kill all the forces involved who carried out the assassination. So he caught the squad who had and wiped them out, who had carried out the killing. He put his guys into the main employers club in Barcelona and killed a load of the employers, and he also ambushed and killed the cardinal. And the thing is that also when you have to the Catholic Church, of course, as you would expect in such a society, was deeply rooted into the right wing. And was particularly hostile to the anarchists, and spent their time actually assisting and aiding the organisation of death squads and so on, particularly vicious organisation. So I mean, in those terms, an interesting thing. I think there is an extraordinary amount of literature on Spain, and I will put up some of the stuff in reading this.
Okay, thanks, Matthew. Next comrade is Steve Freeman.
Hi, Matthew, thank you for that talk. I just want to go back to where Dave was, I think, if I understood what Dave Turner was saying previously, and that was about it's not really enough for us just to analyse Spain as being capitalist in general.
You're muted, comrade.
Start again then. I thought I'd unmuted myself. There we go. Start again then.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, you probably didn't hear that. So just going back to where Dave, what I've understood from what Dave said before, it's not enough just to analyse Spain as being a capitalist country or capitalist society. You've got to analyse the particular development of capitalism as it took place in the Spanish state, in the Spanish social formation. And the story that we have here about land, for example, and the aristocracy and the monarchy. So we have a story here that Spain was a monarchy until 1931, and it became a republic because of local elections when the working class came out and voted for a republic. And so in 1931, Spain becomes a republic, and it remains a republic till 1939, I think, until Franco takes power. Then it remains a fascist state until, again, I don't know, have the dates down, but say about 1975, I guess. Then it becomes a constitutional monarchy again. So we've gone full circle. So I guess Spain's going to become a republic soon. And of course, in Catalonia, there is an attempt for the Catalans to become a republic. They've even declared themselves to be one, although obviously they've not been allowed to do that. So there's a whole cycle going on here. But if we look at the Republican period from 1931, I want to really ask a question about Matthew, about what's going on between 1931 to 1936 prior to that uprising, and in particular what Trotsky was talking about then, because it's one thing to replace a monarchy with a republic, but if all that is the same monarchical state, you've simply become a republic, the same state apparatus, the same machinery. Nothing really changes all that much. You've got a kind of imperial republic almost. Maybe that's what we should call it in 1931, which is why hanging on to Morocco is so important. So the bourgeoisie have just changed clothing and they've now become Republican in the way they're running Spain. But Trotsky was taking up arguments in 1931, 1932 that what the movement should do is extend the democratic revolution, and he certainly argued for a constituent assembly. I think I haven't read up on this before this meeting, Matthew, so you probably have to correct me, so I haven't looked back to that, but I'm pretty sure he was arguing for a constituent assembly. He was arguing for building workers' councils. I think he would have been arguing for dealing with the Moroccan question, and so the colonial question. So I think he had a democratic program that you could say was preparing for a different kind of republic. In other words, there's a transition, a struggle going on, because after 1931, the class struggle hops up until it comes to 1936. So the republic, it opens up the revolution. It almost makes the revolution, it makes the revolt of the army and all the rest of it against that to be possible. So I think we have to look at what happens when a country becomes a republic. When it starts out as a monarchy, then it becomes a republic, what happens next? And there's a polarization towards dual power taking place from 1931 onwards. so that's a period I'm just interested a little bit in going back to that period, Matthew, to see what you had to say about that. Obviously, you were mainly talking about the events of 36, 37, and obviously that's the high point of the revolution. But how do we get to that point, I suppose, is my question around that. Let me just say, is there anything else I wanted to say about that? No, I don't think there is. Right, that will do. Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Steve. This is really the last call for questions. Unless any comrades want to come in, I'll ask Matthew to sum up and respond to Steve's question. I don't see any hands up. So if you'd like to just respond to Steve, Matthew, and then we'll finish up there. Okay, thanks.
Okay, yeah, I think what you can see, in terms of the fall of Riviera, which is in 1930, and which is essentially an argument between him and the king. The king orders him out, essentially orders him out of the country, and he goes off to Paris, and as dies a few months later. So each deep instability, and I think similarly to the fact that obviously then you have the essentially the king leaves, under addition of the crisis. The king actually just leaves the country, and therefore effectively vacates the monarchy, and it's gone. It's very interesting. There is a piece by a selection of Trotsky's writings on Spain. He certainly didn't write near as much on Spain as he did on Germany or Britain. And again, I'll put it up, but I think it's not. In those terms, it's a facet of the crisis of the Spanish state itself, and of the relations, the nature of class relations. So you can see, there's not this sort of great conflict. I mean, obviously, it's different now. I mean, when you're looking at a situation where the monarchy is seen as a key bulwark, and of course the whole thing's being revealed as being incredibly corrupt, which is clearly some more fundamental questions are being fought out here, because obviously you would expect monarchies to be pretty damn corrupt anyway. Clearly these, all this stuff's in the air. So, I mean, in those terms, I think that it's the end of the monarchy in 31 actually just prefigures the deeper crisis, which then precedes the fall of a series of governments, and of course the rise of the right. Gilles Robles and the CDA, and then obviously the fascists and the army. The question of the army, which was then says essentially to the fate of the landed gentry in Spain. I mean, in terms of Morocco, I mean, I think okay, people point out obviously there was quite profitable iron ore and so on, but I mean clearly there's a whole question of maintaining some kind of colonialism and understanding, in terms of a colonialist world. And I think Spain and the Spanish ruling class would see itself as being, quite the poor relation, and to give up Morocco would be like the last straw as far as they were concerned, so they weren't going to do it. But I think the the thing is, I mean, in closing, I think that there's some things that you have to sort of draw from Spain. I mean, the first one, of course, I think is that obviously the importance of workers' power and the organs of the working class has to build its own power. I mean, it might not call itself Soviet, but it's effectively that's what it is. The workers' councils of some sort, and it has to actually understand the necessity of actually overthrowing the ruling class and coming to power itself, the dictatorship of proletariat. The second thing, subsidiary to that one, of course, is that, and one we've been taught again in the Labour Party, is always strike your opponent as hard as you can when he's down. Never let him get back up if you possibly can avoid it. Really, under the conditions, make sure you finish them off. Otherwise you're going to pay, because it always comes back. Okay, thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, Matthew, and thanks very much to all the comrades who've contributed this evening. I'm sure that we've all learned a lot from Matthew's contribution and also from the questions. This is we're getting towards the end now of this series of revolution and counter-revolution, and next week's session is on the revolutions against the empires, the anti-imperialist and national movements throughout the world, which, while the revolutions are going on in the main developed economies, events in Stalinist Russia, there are also revolutionary movements fighting against imperialism and for national liberation throughout the world. So it's going to be quite a tour of the world next week, which I'll be undertaking. And that really will bring the series to an end, apart from a conclusion. So it's been a long march, but we're getting there eventually. Anyway, once again, thanks very much, Matthew. Thanks very much to all the comrades who've contributed and asked the questions. And I look forward to seeing you all again next week. So good night and thank you.
Thanks, guys.